Hello, good morning, and welcome to Nature Live Online from the Natural History Museum. I'm Khalil Thurlaway. While the museum's doors may have finally reopened to visitors, we still want to make sure the museum is as safe as possible for everyone. So for the time being, we'll still be hosting these shows online rather than in our studio at the museum. We've put in a load of measures to make sure that you can have a fun and safe time at the museum, and you can find out all the details on our website. Today, we're going to be chatting about dinosaurs, and more specifically, an ongoing controversy over what their skin was covered with. To give me all the gossip, I've got Paul Barrett, who studies dinosaurs at the museum. Hi, Paul. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, good morning, Khalil. How are you doing?
I'm excited to talk about dinosaurs. You know, it's always one of the best subjects. Obviously, all other subjects are super interesting as well. We'd love to keep you guys at home as well. So if you've got any questions today, please do pop them in the comment section, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time we've got. So before we start getting into the nitty-gritty of the content of today's talk, why don't you just introduce yourself to our audience and let them know what is it that you do at the museum?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm one of the many scientists that work behind the scenes at the museum, involved in looking after collections, but also researching those collections and trying to use them to find out more about the world around us. So my particular specialization is dinosaurs, and I work on lots of different types of dinosaurs and lots of questions around them, including where dinosaurs initially came from, how they diversified into the wide variety of types we see, aspects of their biology, aspects of their evolution, and aspects of their behavior. So I'm pretty much interested in anything to do with dinosaurs.
Well, they are fascinating. And I think we're going to touch on quite a few of those areas in today's discussion, because we're going to be talking about feathers. And some of our audience might have already heard about feathery dinosaurs and the kind of discussions around that. But let's start off from something we're all really familiar with and go from there. So birds. Nowadays, the main place we'll see feathers is on birds. And there are different types of feathers, and we see them in different shapes and doing different things. Why don't you kind of talk us through that, and then we'll go on to the dinosaurs from there.
Exactly right. So when we look at living animals, feathers are only seen in birds, and they've always been thought to be a unique feature of birds. So if you found something with feathers on, you generally assume that you were looking at a bird. And feathers are really important in the way of lives of birds. They get used for lots of different functions during the life of a bird and are really critical to how they function on a day-to-day basis. They do all sorts of different jobs for the animals, most obviously, as shown in this beautiful photo, in terms of flight. So they help to make those wings nice aerodynamic surfaces to allow them to take to the air. And that's usually the thing that people first think of when they think of feathers, is that they're associated with flying.
And there are other kind of other ways that birds use feathers nowadays as well. So, for example, you know, this owl that you know, I'm assuming from its plumage in the background, it's living in quite a cold environment. So, what sort of applications might its feathers have for this?
Yeah, exactly. So not only for flight, but feathers have lots of different functions. There are lots of different types of feather, and those different feather types have specialist features. So the flight feathers have long and they're specially shaped to form that flight surface. But other feathers are there to be made of down, like the sort of thing you might find stuffed in a cushion or a pillow. And the reason that we use them for that stuffing is because they're warm and they're fluffy. So like this big bundle of floof that you see in this snowy owl right here, that is using a lot of its feathers for retaining warmth and trapping that warm air close to its skin. And not only for keeping itself warm, but birds also use those feathers for helping to keep their eggs warm when they're sitting on the nest. So yet another function of feathers.
And on top of flight and warmth, we've also got, you know, obviously display feathers like this from the peacock. And these are some very kind of varied and complex structures and applications of feathers. How do we think that these all came about?
So there's been a lot of debate about the origin of feathers. So feathers are really complicated biological structures. They have lots of components to them. They form in a very unusual way within the skin of the animal. And there's been a lot of debate over the years as to where feathers came from and how they took up all these different tasks that we now see in living birds. So this has been a really active area of research over the years. But for many years, the fossil record hasn't been able to contribute much to those debates. Most of that work has been done by people looking at living birds and also in the lab to look at the genetics of how these things might happen. But more recently, we've started to be able to make a stronger contribution to those debates.
So where's the first evidence of feathers that we see in the evolutionary record, in the fossil record?
So the earliest feathers we know about are in this animal here, which if you're lucky enough to visit the museum, you'll be able to see in our treasures gallery. And this is Archaeopteryx, the earliest known bird. And if you look very carefully at this, this is almost like 2 pages of book. So this is a fossil slab split down the middle with the 2 leaves, with a skeleton on one of those halves and impressions of the skeleton on the other. And if you look around the skeleton, you should be able to see lots and lots of long feathers actually coming around the tail of the animal towards the bottom of that image, and in the top of the image, all those feathers around the wings. And this is the earliest known bird. And the reason that Archaeopteryx was originally thought to be the earliest known bird is precisely because of these feathers. And it was thought feathers were unique to birds. As a result, there's no other type of animal that Archaeopteryx could have been. And this would have been around 150 odd million years ago in the late Jurassic period, flying around or walking around an area of what's now southern Germany.
And I think this is a good time to answer a couple of questions from some of our viewers. We've got a question from Theo, who's asking, did Archaeopteryx and other kind of early feathered animals, how good were they at flying? Because
that's actually really
quite a lot of feathers.
They did. So we know that they had a lot of feathers and that some of those feathers looked a lot like the flight feathers of living birds. But there are a number of things that we don't know, unfortunately, about Archaeopteryx. We don't know too much about the muscles that would have powered those wings. We're not too sure how good a flyer it might have been. And over the years, scientists have disagreed about this. Some think that maybe Archaeopteryx was climbing up trees and using those feathers to glide between the treetops. Others think that they could have actively flapped their wings and flown for at least short distances. The wings are quite stubby. And I also think they probably didn't have the right kind of build for long distance flight. But it does seem like they probably would have been able to fly for little distances, so not nearly as good at maneuvering through the trees as a living bird might be. I don't think they had that fine control, but certainly taking their first leaps into the air, probably.
Or maybe, it could have been a way of escaping from predators or something. Like when you see flying fish kind of leap out of the water and glide a little bit.
It could be. I mean, there's lots of arguments over what drove birds to take to the air. Was it that they were living in trees and it just became more convenient for them to go longer distances? Was it because they were running along the ground and trying to leap out of the way or climb up trees and get out of the way of predators, or to reach new food resources up in those trees? So again, it's one of the big mysteries about the origin of birds that we still talk about a lot because we don't have a clear idea yet.
And when we're talking about the kind of early evolution and early evidence of feathers, we had a question from YouTube asking what feathers are made of.
So feathers are made of a protein. So they're made of a protein very similar to the kinds that make up our own fingernails. It's different in a number of ways, but it's essentially the same kind of stuff, the same stuff that makes up fingernails or the horn of rhinoceros. Feathers are also made out of that protein called keratin. And they develop from little buds in the skin, which then start off to build the feather-like structure out of them. So they're not the same as hair, but in some ways you can imagine they're a little bit similar to the fact that when you look at your hairs, they're in follicles on your head or wherever you have hair on your body, and they come out of those follicles and they start to develop in a certain way. So made of keratin, and they're produced by your skin.
I think so. So that's giving us a really nice solid foundation of what feathers are. But so you're saying Archaeopteryx was initially seen as kind of the first bird, but that was mainly based on kind of how advanced its feathers were and stuff. But those feathers, it's unlikely that they just appeared out of nowhere, evolutionarily speaking. So what evidence do we have of the precursors of feathers?
Well, for many years, Archaeopteryx was really the only evidence we had about where feathers in birds appeared from. And we were left looking around for other clues before that. But then in the mid-1990s, spectacular new fossils started to be found in China. And those fossils showed dinosaurs with their skin preserved, or evidence of what was on their skin preserved. And they began to give us clues as to what those pre-Archaeopteryx animals might have looked like in terms of their skin coverings. And
so what's this species we're looking at?
So this is an animal called Cyanosauropteryx, and this was the first dinosaur found with these feather-like structures on its skin. And you can see when we look at the fossil, you can see these kind of fluffy, tufty-like things running down all the way from the back of the head, all the way along the back and along the tail. And these aren't the same as the feathers that we'd see in a modern bird, in terms of they don't have all the complicated branches and things like that, but they do look like the first steps towards a feather, a sort of kind of fluffy, tubular, almost filament-like structure that seems to be the evolutionary starting point of where feathers might come from.
So kind of like a bristly fuzz type thing.
It's a good description.
And Aaron, one of our viewers, has asked, do we know what colours these might have been?
That's also some really exciting new work that's going on right now. So when I used to give talks on dinosaurs, even 5-10 years ago, I used to say one of the things that we will never know about a dinosaur is what color it was, simply because the pigments and so on in the skin usually degrade very quickly during the fossilization process. But it does turn out that in some cases, and in particular, some of these dinosaurs from China, the preservation is so good that using high-powered microscopes and also other chemical techniques, we can get some ideas about the original colors they might have had. So Cyanosauropteryx, for example, there's some suggestion that some of it would have been a little gingery in color. Other bits might have been a kind of rusty brown. So it does look like with some dinosaurs, so far only a handful, we might even be able to get a bit of information on those colors.
It's amazing how, with new analytical techniques, we can open up areas of study that we previously thought were totally unknowable. So going back to these early proto-feathery dinosaurs, so most of these early feather-type structures we found in one group of dinosaurs, isn't it? The kind of the theropods, these bipedal, meat-eating kind of group of dinosaurs. Can you expand on that a little bit?
That's exactly right. So Cyanosauropteryx is what we call a theropod. These are the meat-eating dinosaurs. And as more finds have been made in these places in China and also now in other fossil deposits around the world, we've found a variety of different types of theropods that we either know had feathers because we see the fossils with the feathers directly on them, or that we can guess had feathers because of other clues that the skeletons give us. And in particular, we know that a lot of the more advanced theropod dinosaurs, the ones that are getting close towards the origin of birds, definitely had theropods. So things like Velociraptor, things like Troodon, animals like this, I don't think very few of my colleagues around the world would disagree with that view now. And indeed, we're fairly happy, I think, with many theropods, if not most of them, probably being feathered in some way or other from most of their evolutionary history.
It's interesting to see the makeover that Velociraptor has had since Jurassic Park. It's looking a little bit fancier now.
It is a lot fancier. It's been blinged out now. So they've added a lot more bling to this Velociraptor. So even we've been able to reflect this more recently in our own displays at the museum. So a lot of our meat-eating dinosaurs now we will always try and put feathers on.
I like how this particular model in the museum is doing a bit of jazz hands as well. It's its new outfit.
Well, actually, the hands on this are pretty good because it's showing the hands in the right place for a dinosaur, which is natural clappers rather than pianists. So you often think dinosaurs won't get their hands like this, which is wrong because they have their hands like that. So yeah, jazz hands is good because jazz hands is how they would have actually been holding those hands up.
If there's one piece of information from today's discussion that has really made my day, it's dinosaur jazz hands. We've got a question from Sally asking about theropod feathers, and she's asking whether Tyrannosaurus Rex would have had kind of more modern branched kind of bird type feathers or little spiky quills or a mixture.
We do know from an early relative of T-Rex, also from China, that it does have a mixture of different types of feathers on its body. So the general group that T-Rex belongs to among theropods, which are called Tyrannosaurs, at least some of those we have direct evidence that they had them. T-Rex itself, which I'm going to put in a plug for being the most overrated dinosaur, unfortunately, of all time at this point, because I know people would be disappointed if I didn't at least take one opportunity to say that. But T-Rex fossils, so far, the only thing T-Rex itself, we do have some skin impressions, but they're of scales. Only of scales. We don't have direct evidence of feathers in T-Rex yet, but those scales only come from a few patches of the body of a T-Rex. And it could be that more feathery-like things are on other bits of the body that we don't know what they look like yet. And my suspicion would be that actually some kind of fuzz will turn up in a T-Rex at some point, because a lot of its very close relatives do have fuzz.
Well, I for one, I'm glad that we managed to get in a little bit of you cussing T-Rex, because actually that our viewers, Victoria, had asked what your least favorite dinosaur is.
T-Rex.
So so we've got a consensus that a lot of these theropods had feathers of various descriptions. But where does opinion start to diverge? So did all theropods have feathers?
As far as we know, a lot of the advanced theropods did. We have a bit of a gap in our knowledge, unfortunately, because we don't have very many special fossil sites from early in dinosaur history to prove that all theropods have it. So as we go down the theropod family tree closer towards the origin of dinosaurs, way back in the Triassic period, our evidence gets more meager for feathers. So we're not really sure if they definitely had them at that stage or if feathers came later in their evolutionary history.
And broadening out from here, actually, a viewer, Katie, asked a really prescient question, because I'm just about to get to that point in our discussion. The ornithischians, the bird-hipped dinosaurs, so that a lot of the the ceratopsids, the horned dinosaurs and stuff, do we see feather-like structures in them?
So this is where some of the real controversy comes in. So there are 3 species of ornithischian dinosaur where it's been suggested that they might have feathers or feather-like structures. And this is one of them. The first one where they were reported an animal called Pterosaurus, which is an early relative of Triceratops from about 100 million years ago. And one specimen of Pterosaurus from China has these very long, weird, quill-like filaments that stick out from its tail. And when this was discovered, it was thought that maybe these quill-like features might be something to do with feathers. And if this ornithischian dinosaur maybe had feathers, as well as all the theropod dinosaurs that we already knew about with feathers, maybe that was suggesting that all dinosaurs had feathers. So it opened up a huge new area of debate about whether feathers were contained in the immediate ancestors of birds, the theropods, or whether they were a more general feature of dinosaurs and we should be thinking about them in terms of dinosaur biology in general.
Well, I think we've got a little pictorial representation of this to kind of simplify it a little bit. So, on the left here, we've got the bird-hipped dinosaurs, like the Stegosaurus and the Triceratops, some of those that you might be familiar with. And quite early on, they diverged from the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, the saurus, which led to the kind of the sauropods, like Diplodocus and stuff, theropods, so things like and so even here on the left, you can see that the Psittacosaurus with the green line on the left and Qian Yulong with the orange line, they have various kind of feather-like structures that we're noticing, but they're not as advanced, and we're not quite sure whether they're kind of what we call convergent evolution, so different routes to the same outcome, or they might come from the same route, but we just haven't got the evidence for it. But then, like you said, later on, the theropods, they split. Well, the Saurissia split off into the kind of advanced theropods on the right with all those feathers as you get towards the lighter yellows. So this is kind of the evidence that we've got at the moment. But like you said, the more we find out, we could find a specimen that's quite near the base of this family tree that really changes the game and makes us think that maybe all dinosaurs evolved feathers the same route.
Yeah, so there's some interesting stuff going on here. So either at the moment, what we've got is a situation where it could be that all dinosaurs did have feathers, and that a few of the ones that we know had lots of scales, maybe they lost their feathers during their evolutionary history. They got rid of them for some reason, but maybe they're descended from ancestors that once had feathers. But you can also flip that round and say maybe the things that we see in the bird-hipped dinosaurs are not feathers, but they're just weird skin structures that popped up independently of those that we see in the theropods on the other side of the dinosaur family tree. And it's very hard to choose between those 2 alternatives at the moment.
And if we do go with if you go with the assumption that all dinosaurs had feathers in that kind of one possible hypothesis, one possible scenario, does that mean that maybe relatives of the dinosaurs might have had feathers? Because, for example, you've got the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles from that time, like Pteranodon and pterodactyl and stuff like that, Rhamphorhynchus. What do we know about them?
So pterosaurs are a close evolutionary cousins of dinosaurs. They share a lot of features in common with them. They're not dinosaurs, they're a distinct group, but they are closely related. And we've known for quite a long time that at least a few of these animals also had some evidence of a fuzzy coating. And actually, a few examples of that have been found more recently too. And some of those not only have a fuzzy coating, but one or two species have things that some of my colleagues have suggested look a little bit more like a bird feather. So this has opened the debate of not only do dinosaurs as a group all have feathers or not, but maybe this broader group of reptiles also includes pterosaurs. Maybe they all had feathers or not. So there are lots of different possibilities at the moment up for grabs, and a lot of arguments taking place over how ancient feathers really are. Do they go a long way back in time and characterize this much bigger group of reptiles, or are feather-like features just popping up independently a lot in this part of the reptile evolutionary tree?
And this kind of links into what one of our viewers, Chris, was asking about, did pterosaurs have bird-like feathers? And if so, were they used for flight or for other things? Because, you know, pterosaurs, their wings were made of membrane, like a bat, right?
Exactly right. So pterosaurs definitely have a bat-like wing, and so it's made of skin that's stretched between its long fingers. So it's using that skin to make most of the surface area of the wing, whereas in birds, they're mainly using feathers to use the surface area of the wing. So there's a bit of a difference in how they build their wings. But in pterosaurs, it could be that these fuzzy-like coverings, like in birds today, are also have other functions. It could have been for brooding their young, it could have been for display, it could have been for keeping themselves warm. So again, we have exactly the same set of arguments over why pterosaurs might have had these features as to why dinosaurs had it. The one thing they weren't using it for is a wing. So they definitely weren't using it for flight in the same way that a bird does. So in pterosaurs, one of those other explanations to do with keeping the body warm or display is probably more likely than flight.
So actually, that feeds us into a nice question from Reese, one of our viewers, who's asking, you know, non-flying dinosaurs, what were they using feathers for? So you've listed a couple of possibilities like warmth and display. Like, could it be possibly maybe protection, like a lion's mane or something? Or, you know, what are some of the theories that are out there?
So the two main theories, obviously, although feathers become used for flight later on in birds, they appear in dinosaurs that aren't flying. So feathers did not appear for flight, but they might have been, but they became useful for flight later on in birds. So the two main theories are it is to do with something to do with insulation to help keep your body temperature up. And if you can keep your body temperature high, it usually means you can be a more active animal. You can be active at night. You can run faster. You can do different things. Or it could simply be to show off to each other. Or it could actually be a combination of those two things. Or it could just be something we haven't even thought of yet. My hunch for dinosaurs would be that actually, to start with, it might have been something to do with display. And the reason I think that is when we look at the dinosaurs with those early feathers, they often have them on the arms and also forming little tail fans. And they seem to be in exactly the places that if you wanted to show off to someone that you want to back out of your territory or that you're trying to attract a mate with you, they're on those parts of the body that you can immediately use to show off. And I suspect they then later became useful for other things as well, maybe for brooding the eggs, maybe for insulation. So I'm not a betting man, but my hunch would be that display is a big part of the story. And also feathers are cheap to make. They're kind of, because they're just made of protein, you can put lots of different pigments in them, you can make them lots of bright colors and patterns. And so I think display is going to be important early on in the evolution of them. And then flight becomes much more important later on.
Louise has just asked a really interesting question. What about camouflage as a possible use?
Entirely possible. I mean, living birds use them for camouflage all the time. So some birds are obviously we think of birds that are often very brightly colored and very flashy, but a lot of birds, if you think of things like nightjars, it's almost impossible to see them when they're on the ground because they're so well camouflaged against the background. And that's as good an idea for why you might want feathers to start with as any other, to be fair.
So we've given a bit of a kind of sum up of the various arguments and the various camps. What is your personal opinion? I'm gonna push you to put your flag somewhere.
I'm happy to plant my flag somewhere. So my suspicion at the moment is that I think theropod dinosaurs have things that are definitely evolutionary precursors of the feathers we see in birds. They look very similar. These are animals that are closely related. So for sure, I think you would see feathers in a lot of theropods, even if maybe not all theropods, but I could be persuaded that there were if we found the right fossils. I think the feathers that we see probably in the bird-hipped dinosaurs are probably an independent invention of those kinds of features. It's simply because when we look at ornithischian dinosaur skin, most of it's usually scaly. So I don't think there's a lot of evidence from the bird-hipped dinosaurs yet to convince me that dinosaurs all started off as being feathery.
And there are other examples of weird structures that have come from scales as well, right?
There are. I mean, one of the reasons I'm suspicious is when we look at both living and extinct reptiles, we see that they experiment with their skin a lot. And they do a lot of weird things with their scales. So this is a little animal called Longisquama, which is from the Triassic of Italy. And it has these amazingly weird scales along its back. And actually, there's been a big debate over whether these are ancestral to feathers or not. The majority of specialists now think these are just really weird scales rather than true feathers. And this gives you an idea that you can have something that's very, very feather-like, that's nothing actually to do with feathers. And even if we look at fairly well-known reptiles today, things like iguanas, we can see that they have these huge fringing scales along their back, huge pointed floppy scales that don't look like the scales that you see on the rest of the body. There are ones that have scales that when you look at them closely almost look like little toilet brushes. That have all these kind of little filaments coming out of them. So I think there's a lot, I think reptiles in general probably experimenting with their skin much more than we normally give them credit for. And as a result, I think we have to be very careful of just assuming that one explanation accounts for all of the different structures that we see in the extinct animals that we're starting to find these skin structures in.
I guess something that we're really learning from this discussion is that scales are more varied and more interesting than we might think. You know, everyone thinks of scales as just, oh, it's just a square, hard patch of skin, but they can come in all these amazing evolved forms. We've got a question from Evie, who's asking if there's any evidence of sauropods with feathers.
None at all at the moment. So none of the animals, either in the sauropods or in their immediate ancestors, have any evidence of feathers. All that we know about their skin at the moment is that they're scaly. But I would say there are a couple of things that would overturn this and would make me change my mind. So for example, if we found a sauropod ancestor with feathers, that would make it a much stronger argument for saying that all dinosaurs had feathers, because then each of the three big groups of dinosaurs would have something with feathers in them. And actually in general, finding early dinosaurs from the Triassic period, if any of those guys had feathers, that would also make it a much stronger case that all dinosaurs have feathers to start with. So those are two things where we need to find more fossils. And people, if they can go out and find those fossils, I would be very happy to change my mind.
I think this is a really good example of how, in science in general, but especially in paleontology, every time we find a new bit of evidence, yes, it answers a couple of questions, but it also asks a whole load more questions, because you know, every time we find that there's, another branch of dinosaurs with some feather-like structures, yes, it tells us that ornithischians, some of them had feathers or feather-like structures. It also asks all these other questions about, you know, the bigger picture, which is one of my favorite things about science. There's some people on both Facebook and YouTube who've been asking about, so we've talked about dinosaurs and we've talked about their flying cousins, the pterosaurs. But what about the marine reptiles that were around at the same time? So like the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and stuff like that.
So first of all, they're not dinosaurs. They're different, distinct groups of reptiles that lived at the same time as dinosaurs, but weren't particularly closely related. And unfortunately, we don't know a huge amount about their skin. We know a bit because we have some places where impressions of their skin survive. And from what we can tell, in most cases, they actually have a slightly different kind of skin again. It's not scaly, it's not feathery. Instead, it's much more leathery, almost, if you like, a little bit like the skin of a dolphin, like that kind of smooth, leathery sheen to it.
Obviously, they're different evolutionary paths.
Yes, they're not the same as a dolphin, but equally, it could be because they're living in the sea. They've evolved a very similar structure to their skin. but they don't seem to have the kinds of typical scales we'd expect in a reptile. Neither do they have, it looks like they're, again, experimenting with their skin, which strengthens that point that I'm trying to make about the fact that actually reptiles do a lot of things with their skin. It's not just that they have scales. One of the coolest things about birds, I mean, if you think of a chicken, has scales on its feet. Any bird has scales on their feet, if you think of the talons of an eagle or something. But those scales are actually probably weirdly reduced feathers and not scales.
So they've gone from scales to feathers and then evolved
and then back again
to being scale.
So they have some, when we look at the genetics of how scales form on the feet of birds, they're actually quite different from how the scales of, say, a lizard form, but have much more in common with how a feather forms. So they're doing something very weird. So even looking at the kind of reptile-like scales of a chicken's foot, you're actually looking at some weirdly specialized structure that's actually quite different from that you'd see in a crocodile or a lizard.
And on the subject of birds, we know that birds, they are what we call warm-blooded or kind of endothermic. How does the feather, on the ongoing kind of feather debate, affect the discussion about whether we think dinosaurs were cold or warm-blooded?
It fits in quite a lot because a lot of those early meat-eating dinosaurs that get feathers are relatively small. They're animals that are only a meter or less in length. And it's been suggested that getting those feathers was a way of helping those small animals retain heat. Big animals retain heat very easily. Their bodies just hold on to it. It doesn't leave their bodies to the environment very quickly. But small animals are constantly losing heat very, very quickly. And maybe part of the argument is those small dinosaurs were trying to retain the heat so they could be more active, and maybe the development of this fuzzy outer layer helped them do that.
Okay, so anyway, these are two kind of ongoing discussions that I guess the more we find out about one of them, the more that kind of informs and gives us material for the other discussion. And we've got a couple of questions from our viewers about kind of specimens and their kind of influence on it. So Samantha has been asking, what is kind of one of the best preserved specimens that you can think of, and what dinosaur was it, and kind of what impact did such a well-preserved specimen have on the debates?
Well, a lot of these Chinese specimens that we're talking about are really spectacular because they're not just the bones, and often not only the bones but whole skeletons, but they have these soft tissue features that we normally don't see preserved around them. So they have evidence of the skin and the structures coming from the skin. Some of them often have gut contents that tell you what their last meal was. A few of them even have even more detail of that, telling you about some of the other soft tissue structures around the body, muscle fibers, things like that. So we're starting to get a few really exceptional specimens that are changing things. And I'd say Cyanosauropteryx, that first discovered feathered dinosaur, on its own led to a revolution in how we generally think about dinosaur biology.
And what makes these specimens in different places preserved differently?
It's down to the geology. It's an accident of where the animals lived and where they died. So in the case of these places in China where we've got the majority of these spectacular specimens, these are animals living around small, shallow lakes where there happen to also be lots of volcanoes nearby. And when those volcanoes erupt, they send huge amounts of ash into the air. The animals die as a result of the eruptions, usually by being suffocated by the gases and so on. Their bodies fall into these lakes and quickly get entombed by this very fine-grained volcanic ash. That stops the decay of these features very quickly and allows more time for them to be preserved in the fossil record. So they're living in an unusual place with a happy set of geological features that mean that we get those levels of preservation that in other places that stuff would all just rot away before the skeleton was buried.
And kind of in a similar vein, while we're talking about kind of specimens and discovery of them, what do you think is one of the most important dinosaur discoveries, most influential finds of the last 10 years? We've got a question from YouTube asking that.
Well, that's a really good question, actually. I think you get as many different answers to that question as there are dinosaur specialists you'd ask, because we all have our own specific interests in different areas of dinosaur tree. So other than thinking about things like feathers, that's actually a really hard question to put me on the spot. I'm not sure.
We can circle back around to it if you want.
No, I'm trying desperately to think what because there have been so much work on dinosaurs in the last 10 years, it's actually hard to pick a single thing that's kind of shifted everything that we think about. And I think feathered dinosaurs were one of those. But I can't. Ooh, I'm going to have to think about that a bit longer. I genuinely.
Okay, we can come back to it at the end. We've just had one thing I think is a really, really interesting question from Neela, asking which dinosaur, in your opinion, has some of the strangest or most outlandish physiological attributes?
In terms of, well, some of the weirder ones are going to be things that we just don't expect. So, for example, not particularly unusual dinosaurs, but there are a bunch of dinosaur groups that have species that live, for example, in what's now the Antarctic and the Arctic Circle. So these are animals that we would normally think of as some sort of reptile-like physiology, although probably quite different from what we'd see in a crocodile or a lizard today. But they're living in places where there would have been snow, where water would have frozen for a large part of the year, where they're experiencing 6 months of darkness a year or migrating in and out of these areas. So it's interesting that dinosaurs managed to live in the full range of habitats that we see on land, despite the fact that we generally think of them as a kind of having one kind of rule for their physiology in terms of were they probably somewhere between being warm-blooded and cold-blooded. But they do been able to take that in lots of different directions.
So these habitats, are they habitats that were at the poles, you know, at the time of the dinosaurs? Because I know that the continental plates have moved around a lot in that time.
At the time that the animals I'm thinking about, we're looking at near the end of the Cretaceous period, so animals about, say, 70 million years ago. And at those times, those land masses aren't quite where they are today, but they're almost there. So they are certainly within our definition of, say, the Arctic Circle or the Antarctic Circle today. So they're genuinely living in places that are suffering those differences in daylight, that have these very strong differences between summer and winter. And so it's interesting to think that those that, like mammals do manage today, if you think about bison and caribou in the Arctic, they are managing to make probably a living there all year round, which suggests that their physiology is much better at coping with these conditions than we would have thought 10 or 20 years ago.
So I think we've got time for just a couple more questions before we wrap up. We've had a question from Leah on Facebook asking, and you know, we've talked a lot about the relationships between birds and dinosaurs, but what is the family tree relationship between lizards and dinosaurs? Because on the surface, I mean, dinosaurs, traditionally we think they look a lot like lizards. They're, you know, they're obviously reptilian, but what's the connection?
So these days, lizards are thought to be quite a long way down the family tree from dinosaurs. They probably had a common ancestor that lived over, well, well over 250 million years ago, probably close to 300 million years ago. Lizards are closely related to snakes. Snakes are essentially a type of special legless lizard. And then as we go up the family tree, we'd find among living reptiles, crocodiles would be the most closely related to dinosaurs and birds, then turtles, and then going a little bit further down the family tree, we get to lizards and snakes. So among living reptiles, lizards and snakes are the most distantly related reptiles to dinosaurs and birds.
Sorry, I missed the end of that. My internet connection dropped out a little bit. But so you were saying that lizards are kind of quite distantly related to...
They are. So they're distant evolutionary
a couple of hundred million years
reptiles, ago. But not particularly close relatives with a very deep ancestry. Crocodiles are much, much more closely related to dinosaurs and birds.
Okay, so I think we're going to do two more questions and then we're going to wrap up. One's a little fun one, and one I think is a really nice place to end. So the first one is Constance and Wilfred have both asked, what is your favorite dinosaur?
Okay, when I was a kid, my favorite dinosaur was Triceratops. It's definitely not T-Rex. T-Rex is a long way down that. As most theropods are a long way down that list, actually.
But why do you like Triceratops?
It was Triceratops. I think it was just because it looked like some kind of amazing fantasy unicorn rhino thing. I'm always very, very keen on horned dinosaurs and just the way they look. Actually, but they're a group of dinosaurs I've not actually worked on that much. I've only worked on horned dinosaurs a little bit during my career, unfortunately. But I was always very, very keen when I was a kid. But my favorite dinosaur now is probably a fairly obscure little dinosaur. It's an animal called Heterodontosaurus. which is about 200 million years old, and it's from what's now South Africa and a couple of countries around South Africa. And it's a very small, early plant-eating dinosaur. And it's kind of the dinosaur equivalent of one of those little tiny deer that you'd find living in a forest today, like a dik-dik or a muntjac or something like that. It would have eaten plants. And the reason that I like it's for two reasons. First of all, I work on early dinosaurs, and I think it's kind of cool for that reason. Secondly, because it used to eat plants, and I mainly work on plant-eating dinosaurs, so it shows how plant-eating dinosaurs get going. But the main reason actually is it's just cute.
Yeah, because you think of dinosaurs as these like big, stompy monsters, but actually there are a huge range of sizes and kind of types of them. So this little cute kind of dik-dik type dinosaur it's a nice little change.
Yeah, no, I think they're genuinely cute. I would quite like having one running around the back garden.
And I do also understand your love for the ceratopsids, the horned dinosaurs. I myself have always been a big fan of Styracosaurus, which I feel like Triceratops, but with a bit of a fancier frill out in the town.
It's all about the bling.
Also, always loved Baryonyx and Iguanodon. I mean, I grew up in South London, so the Iguanodon statues at Crystal Palace Park have always been a favourite of mine. But yeah.
That's a good choice too.
Pardon?
That's a good choice too. And they're also kind of local to us as well. And a lot of people don't realise that in the UK, we actually have a very good record of dinosaurs. And as a result, we've had a lot of different species named from the UK. And most of those species come from Sussex and Surrey and the Isle of Wight and along the south coast, but also with a few in other parts as well. So we also have dinosaurs from the Yorkshire coast, from Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, even up in Scotland, coast of Northern Ireland. We find dinosaurs in the UK wherever we have rocks of the right age.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. So Kalina has asked that if someone wants to get into paleontology, how would they do that? What would they need to study? How could they get involved, maybe in volunteering or helping with digs?
So there are lots of ways you can get involved in paleontology. It's one of those sciences where you can still actually make a really important and valued contribution, even if you're not being paid to do it as a professional in the museum. So there's one route of doing it, which is you try and become one of those people that work in a museum or university, where you get you're either teaching about these things or you're looking after the collections of them. And that involves a kind of traditional route of going to university, doing a degree in geology or biology, and specializing as you go through that kind of educational system to reach those kinds of jobs. But actually we have lots and lots of very keen amateur paleontologists in the country who make really valuable contributions all the time. And to be a paleontologist, all you really need to be is curious and to keep your eyes open and to be good at spotting fossils and thinking about where those fossils pop out, where you find them. And actually, you'd be surprised how much new stuff you can find out just by having sharp eyes and thinking a bit about where you've picked that fossil up and how important it might be. So there are lots of ways you can contribute to paleo. It's not like physics where you need to own your own kind of hadron collider or radio telescope. It is actually something that anyone can do if they're curious about the natural world.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. Thank you so much, Paul. I've really enjoyed chatting to you about dinosaurs. I always do.
It's been a pleasure. Some really nice questions this morning as well. So thanks for those coming in.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us at home today as well. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I did. Please do join us again for more Nature Live shows at 12 on Tuesdays and 10:30 on Fridays. And you can keep an eye on our social media channels. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Periscope, as well as nhm.ac.uk. Until next time, that was Paul Barrett, I'm Khalil Thurloway, and this has been